Hello, and thank you for joining us today to hear about the findings of our personal security research. For those of you who are new to London TravelWatch and what we do, my name is Emma Gibson. I'm the director of London TravelWatch, and we're the independent watchdog set up by Parliament to provide a voice for London's travelling public. We're funded by and accountable to the London Assembly, and our primary aim is to press for a better experience for all transport users in London. Our remit covers you if you get about by bus, by train, on foot or by bike. And we've also got a remit for the streets when it comes to the strategic road network in London. Day to day, we influence and hold to account London's transport providers. So that's mainly TfL, but also other transport bodies and rail companies. So on to the subject of today's webinar. It's the job of the transport industry and the police to keep people safe. And they need people to trust that they'll do that so that we're confident to travel. But what we know is that people who experience an incident that makes them feel unsafe don't necessarily trust that if they report it, it'll be taken seriously or followed up. So this research was commissioned to respond to these kind of issues. And we're very much looking forward to talking to London's transport industry, the Mayor and the police to see what we can do to work together to improve the safety of people travelling in London. So I'm going to hand over to my colleague Sophia, who's been leading this project, to give a bit more background.
Hi everyone, my name is Sophia and I'm a policy officer at London TravelWatch. We launched this project to look at what feeling safe means to transport users and to understand what the priorities should be in terms of investment and improvements that can increase the safety of London's transport network. Today we're going to be sharing a presentation of the findings so far, but before we start, I just wanted to emphasise how important this research is, particularly in the context of where London is after the pandemic. We've always known that personal security is a key issue for London's transport users, and while serious incidents are rare, we know that this is a particular concern to people who are most at risk of being targeted for things like their gender, colour of their skin, or disability. In March this year, the tragic murder of Sarah Everard prompted anger and an outpouring of stories from women who recalled countless stories of harassment and dangerous situations where they've had to take a variety of steps to try and keep themselves safe. When we spoke to young women with the Young Women's Trust as part of this research, they too recounted the experiences and steps taken to avoid unsafe situations on public transport, with some altering their journeys or changing their plans due to safety reasons. As we picked up in our Journey Ahead report earlier this year, we know this fear around personal security is also particularly heightened for disabled people, young people, and people from Black, Asian, and ethnic minority backgrounds. This is also true of those from the Lgbtq community and for those who dress in religious attire. For this reason, we have focused on making sure we represent well across the groups for whom travelling can be a daunting experience, or who have previously encountered unsafe situations or incidents. So before I hand over to Angus, I'm just going to quickly outline the next steps of this research and how you can get involved. Firstly, it's important to highlight that this research is ongoing. A public survey will be open after the webinar and over the summer to give all London transport users a chance to share their views on personal safety. This survey is the same as the one used for the initial research that is being presented today and is intended to provide an even broader range of views from as many London transport users as possible. Anyone who travels in London will be able to fill this out. We encourage everyone to do this to help ensure the transport industry knows what to prioritise when it comes to improving personal safety while travelling. So please do share it widely and encourage people in your network or the people you represent to complete it. The link will be shared at the end of the webinar, but you can also find it on our website. We also encourage you to get in touch with any questions or ideas at info@londontravelwatch.org.uk, as we won't have time to do a live Q&A today. This email address will be posted in the chat and video description. We're really keen to hear from you, particularly if there's anything you think we could work on together. Finally, it's important to note that there is a lot of work going on at the moment in the transport industry to look at the issues around personal safety, whether in relation to hate crime, sexual harassment, or other problems that people face when travelling. and we're really keen to continue to work with the industry to make sure we're doing everything we can to improve how safe people are and feel. So thank you again for joining us. I'm now going to hand over to Angus, who will talk us through the findings and recommendations.
Brilliant, thank you, Safia. My name's Angus. I'm a research manager at a market research agency called Illuminas. We've been working with London TravelWatch to deliver what has been a very rewarding and a very interesting project about personal security and how safe passengers feel on public transport and when travelling around London. Just to walk you briefly through our methodology and what we did. So this is what you would call mixed methods research. We used qualitative research, which is where you speak to relatively few people in a great deal of detail. And we combined that with quantitative research, where you speak to many people and run statistical analysis on the surveys that you've delivered. So we started out with 40 90-minute depth interviews to understand how passengers feel about their personal safety on public transport in London. What drives safety? What drives the feeling of not being safe? And what can be done to improve passengers' experiences as they travel in and around London? Once we had done that, we conducted what we called a working group. We selected 15 respondents who we felt in effect had a problem with public transport and how safe they felt on it. We selected people who identified as feeling fairly or very unsafe in a brief questionnaire that we gave them. And we brought them together with a range of different organisations. They spoke to London TravelWatch, they spoke to Transport for All, the disability transport charity, and they spoke to us as Illuminas researchers. We brought them together to openly discuss the challenges that they face and share, in a way, the kind of practical challenges that that the transport network may also face, to try and understand how they could be overcome, and just to equip these respondents with as many of the facts as possible to make sure that their perspectives were well informed by real world situations, as well as their lived experience of feeling unsafe. Finally, we conducted a survey. We are in the process of getting 400 respondents. These findings that I'm showing you today are based off of 377. So a really nice, robust sample. And we're just using this to quantify our findings, validate some of the conclusions that we came to in the qualitative research, maybe challenge them in places. And as Safia mentioned, we'll be distributing the survey through London TravelWatch's own networks to give as many people as possible the chance to feedback. Looking briefly at who we spoke to, so we had our 40 90-minute interviews. We skewed towards female respondents because the data tells us that they are people who often feel unsafe on public transport. We ensured very strong representation of BAME passengers within the sample. We spoke to 5 people who identified as LGBTQ, 5 people with religious attire, in other words, people whose religious identity is open to the world and therefore potentially at risk of hate crime in a way that people who perhaps do not dress in that way may not experience. And then we spoke to 5 people who identified as having a disability, simply because the transport system is a very different place if you have a disability. Looking at it quantitatively, who did we speak to in our 377 interviews? Well, we skewed deliberately towards younger people. You can see that 24% of our sample is 18 to 24, 35% are 25 to 36. We skewed again towards BAME passengers, skewed again towards female passengers, again, a good representation of non-binary people. And looking at the modes of transport they used, of course, just about everyone walked. Good representation of London Underground, bus, car, both pre and during the coronavirus pandemic. We spoke to 7% of the sample who identified as LGBTQ, which is, I think, very strong representation. 31% who dressed in religious attire, and 16% who identified as having a disability. So a very good, robust sample there that covers a range of different factors that may or may not lead you to feel unsafe or lead you to be at risk of certain kinds of crime. So how do passengers define safety on public transport? Well, it's a fairly intuitive definition. If fundamentally it's the absence of something going wrong, it's the absence of crime, it's the absence of antisocial behavior. It's interesting, you know, when we ran these interviews, we asked people in a much more spontaneous sense, what makes you feel safe or unsafe? It could be your work, your home life, your pedestrian life, your transport life. Everyone zoomed in on the public transport thing. It's by and large where people think about their safety most. There's pedestrian crime, but that's generally understood as being very high impact but low likelihood. These are muggings, assaults out of nowhere. London transport seems to be where the most routine, uncomfortable situations happen. In addition, of course, safety is a feeling. It's not just, I haven't experienced crime, therefore I'm safe. It is also a feeling. Do I feel safe? And lighting was one of the major drivers, both at the street level and on the transport network. Particularly if you're unfamiliar with a given place, you really want it to be well lit. And that familiarity is really important. Passengers build up a set of precautions and a kind of know-how around places that they're aware of. But when the place is unfamiliar, it becomes much less comfortable. And in a sense, the risk feels a lot less knowable. Time of day, understandably very important. In almost all demographics, but particularly women, transport users will avoid traveling at night if they can. For younger women, it's a bit more deliberate and feels a bit more high stakes. They will actively avoid the night tube and take a taxi instead, again, if they can. Now, when we measured it statistically, we asked people how safe you feel on each of these modes of transport. It's interesting, but perhaps unsurprising, that what you might call self-directed modes of transport are the ones that feel safest. If I'm driving my car, if I'm driving my motorcycle, if I'm walking, I am in a sense the one in charge of where I'm going and how long I have to be on that journey. It's when you look at the modes of transport that aren't self-directed, where you think, I'm not in charge, I'm stuck on this train, I am stuck on this bus, and therefore my sense of safety has gone down because your locus of control or your sense of control just isn't quite as strong when you're not the one behind the wheel. Understandably, predictably, even younger people, women, BAME passengers, and those with disabilities were all at greater risk of victimization. Now, there are crime surveys which deal in much larger numbers than these, and perhaps, this is not trying to say that the crime rate is such and such a percent, but it shows that the numbers are not small. I mean, 30% of those with disabilities have experienced hate crime or harassment in the last 3 years. 29% of those 18 to 24 have experienced an unwanted sexual behavior. 18% of those with disabilities have experienced a physical assault. And only 24% of those aged 18 to 24 have experienced no form of crime. So this is a very, these are not small numbers. We are dealing with a large group of people who have good reason to feel unsafe because an unsafe thing has happened to them. Now, when we look at it qualitatively, different modes of transport have different qualities that lead them to feel safer or unsafe. If we start with the bus, it's an interesting feature of the bus that there isn't really seen to be a real barrier to entry. Essentially, anyone can get on, commit a crime, get off the bus quickly. They may even do all this without paying for a ticket, in some passengers' view. So there aren't that many positive experiences of the bus driver proactively intervening to keep passengers safe from crime. We haven't heard much in the way of bus drivers policing their bus, although of course, you know, that their job is to drive the bus, but there is a perception around public transport users that the bus driver is the go-to person for the bus. On the positive side, it is easy to escape an unsafe situation on the bus. If you feel unsafe on the bus, you can just get off. You can request your stop, you can get off, regroup, get the next one. It's above ground. It's easy to phone for help if you feel unsafe. And these are your familiar journeys. No one is taking an intercity bus journey using sort of a red double-decker bus. They're low stakes journeys. And so what that means is that even though statistically the bus may be a higher crime mode of transport, in many transport users' view, it can feel slightly safer. And that may explain what we saw earlier, where the bus was slightly higher up in the safety ranking, if you like, than the tube. Looking at the tube, there's a sense, at least during peak times, that it's almost reassuringly packed. You know, why would a criminal get on the 8:30 train from Brixton to Euston purely to commit a crime? In a sense, the passengers are peeved, aggressive, frustrated, but they're not predatory. It feels like a mode of transport where febrile situations may escalate, but it doesn't feel like one where people are boarding at rush hour purely to commit a crime. On the negative side, there is a lack of Wi-Fi, there's a lack of phone signal, and that can make the in-the-moment help that many passengers are asking for feel very unattainable. And at night, it really does feel like a bit of a free-for-all. It is seen as understaffed, it's seen as kind of, let's just leave the passengers to it and hopefully they're okay. And unfortunately, unwanted sexual behavior can be easily masked by the level of crowding. These situations that take place on the tube can feel very ambiguous and very unclear. They're aware that CCTV exists, but what happens to it and where does it go? And then lastly, the train. It's an expensive mode of transport. It's a high stakes mode of transport. And that leads a lot of people to think, you know, why would someone get on the train from London to Reading to commit a crime? But by that same token, it is a mode of transport that's difficult to escape from in the event of an unsafe situation. I don't want to be stuck at Reading, or I don't want to be stuck at Loughborough Junction if that's not my main station. There is stronger evidence of staff on board, but the role feels unclear. You have catering staff, you have ticketing staff. What is their responsibility in the event of an unsafe situation? It can feel unclear. But of course, just like the bus, it is primarily above ground. You can call the police, but then what would you tell them? Because you're speeding from one city to another in many situations. Now, antisocial behavior, this is understood as annoying. Some people don't particularly mind a bit of drinking on the tube or a bit of graffiti on the tube. But for many people, there is a latent threat of escalation. A passenger who has their feet near me on the seat next to me isn't unsafe. He isn't threatening me. But there is a fear that if I try and stop him, if I call him out on it, then suddenly it escalates into a crime. It becomes much more unsafe. So it can lead passengers to just keep their head down, try and ignore it if they were to witness vandalism or smoking or drinking on the tube. It makes them feel uncomfortable, if not unsafe. And that distinction between unsafe and uncomfortable, I think, is very important. But there is a fear that passengers may suddenly become violent or erratic if you challenge this behavior. So most people would just ignore it or leave. And more than that, it can be a signifier of an unsafe service. If the passenger was able to get away with vandalizing a train, what else could he have got away with? And it was an interesting thought experiment. You know, I would ask people, is graffiti unsafe? And they would say no. And they would say, well, how would you feel if you saw someone doing the graffiti in the moment? And of course, that does feel unsafe. So the signifiers of this behavior can be significantly, it can confer a sense of a lack of safety. It makes passengers nervous, and for some it can really feel like a crime waiting to happen. So it is important to deal with, both for the reputation of the transport network and for the overall comfort of passengers. Now, late at night, of course, was generally seen as the least safe period in which to travel. We asked people to rank different time slots, if you like, from most safe to least safe. And when we got the data back, it came back in perfect chronological order. So it starts off safest in the morning and gets progressively less safe as you go on through the day, to the point where 65% believe that the night period from 10 p.m. to early morning is the least safe time to travel. Now, age. Age has a real influence on how passengers perceive their sense of safety. For me, the most interesting one is this bracket between age 18 to 19, because these are passengers who became adults in many cases during the pandemic. They have not had the conventional induction, if you like, into public transport. They haven't fully acclimatized to public transport. But of course, women in this age category have still experienced catcalling or other unwanted sexual behaviors, even as children. And what many of the crutches or support systems that they use, if you like, is the ability to travel in groups. That is a really important one to them. But of course, as they grow older, that may not be feasible. You know, it's not always possible to travel in a group to your workplace or your college or your university or your workplace. So in a sense, this feels like a group of people who need help, because they haven't had the time or the reassurances that many other passengers have had to feel safer on the transport network. And the risk then is that that their confidence doesn't grow in quite the same way as it may have done for other adults who reached adulthood in a more normal time. Age 20 to 30, so my kind of age bracket, younger workers without a great deal of choice. You know, if I feel unsafe on my journey from Brixton to Euston, there isn't a huge amount I can do to change my journey. I may feel like I want to try something else, but financially or just logistically, these people do not have the opportunity to change mode of transport in the way that older people might. So we have to remember that for every passenger who leaves the public transport network due to safety concerns, there may be one other person who wants to but can't. And as we look to the kind of 31 to 45 age bracket, more confidence, a developed suite of precautions that they feel able to implement in order to keep themselves safe. They're more likely to see themselves as intervening in a crime, but they're still aware that they are potential victims of some crimes. They don't necessarily worry as much about unwanted sexual behavior, but they don't feel 100% safe 100% of the time. Looking at the kind of 45 plus age bracket. Now, these are confident travelers. They feel pretty safe, but paradoxically, they're also the ones who are most able to alter their behavior around public transport. So even if they feel slightly unsafe, even if they've just read something in the news, despite not having been victimized personally, they do have the flexibility to alter their schedule, alter their transport approach, or even change mode altogether. So even though that kind of 45 plus age bracket may not experience victimization in quite the same way that our 18 to 24-year-olds do, they are the ones that have the flexibility to change, and in a sense, they are the ones that the network may lose unless they're supported. And unfortunately, measures, or rather awareness of measures that have been taken in the past few years to keep Londoners safe is very low. indeed, many people feel as though London has become less safe over time. I mean, we've all seen the stories in the news around knife crime and sexual violence. For BAME or European respondents, the impact of Brexit has led to a noticeable increase in the hate crime that they have experienced. And of course, knife crime is a very hot button issue, particularly for those with children. I suppose older respondents, they have the benefit of hindsight. They can recognize that crime has, of course, fallen over decades. It's certainly safer than it may have been when they were teenagers or young adults. But of course, they will still feel as though there is more work to be done. And this chart on the right, it's kind of a glass half full, glass half empty kind of analysis. On the one hand, 41% of people feel as though London has become safer over the last 5 years, but by the same token, 59% of people do not feel that way. Taxis. So we asked people whether they worried particularly about unbooked or unlicensed taxis. It struck many people as something of an old-fashioned problem. The rise of Uber and Lyft and all these kind of ride-hailing apps and their inbuilt safety features like ride tracking and ride sharing and safety reporting buttons built into the app, it almost makes the worry of getting into an unlicensed taxi feel slightly old-fashioned. It just doesn't feel like something anyone would do anymore. But of course, it is still a risk, and it is something that we've seen adverts for around taxis and unbooked taxis in particular. It may just be that there is some education required to contextualize the problem and make it clear that actually, we are not invulnerable because of Uber. We do have to think about our safety in private hire vehicles. It's just a case of making it clear what the risks are and why they still exist. In fact, the combination of convenience and safety that many people see in Uber or Lyft, it leads many passengers to argue that, well, why isn't the public transport network doing this? If Uber can let me report an unsafe driver via their app, why can't the tube? So it may be that we wish to look to Uber or Lyft or other kind of ride-hailing apps as a bit of a success story in terms of safety. Now let's think briefly about the consequences of all this. We asked people who had been the victim of a crime or an unsafe behavior what they did as a result of that crime, and 27% left the mode of transport for a significant period of time afterwards. So just to put that into context, that's more than the number of people who reported it to the police, much more than the number of people who even reported it to a member of transport staff. In effect, these are a hidden group of people who have left the transport network for a time without even leaving a trace or without even reporting it to the police. So we have to keep in mind that out with the moral or ethical problems of people being victimized on public transport, there is also a real point here around passenger numbers. These are passengers that you will lose unless they are made to feel safer. I want to talk briefly around hate crime and sexual harassment. Now, we dealt with this primarily through our qualitative research. And of course, BAME passengers, those who wear religious attire day to day, they are conscious of hate crime, and personal victimization was very common. What's interesting here is the way in which people talk about these crimes. Very few people felt that they were just being victimized out of the blue. Often it was an escalation from an argument over seating, over queuing, or other day-to-day issues that will escalate suddenly and appallingly into a hate crime. And that has a bearing on how we talk about the issue, but it also has a bearing on how we think about the efficiency of the transport network, because many argue that actually, if you can just bring the level of stress down in the transport system, you are also making it safer for protected groups. because hate crime is seen as the result of a stressful situation coupled with an ignorant individual who can't control their temper. If you can bring the stress down, you are making safety much more apparent. You are making the transport network safer by proxy, if you like. But more than that, there is a point here around promoting general consideration of each other, that it's not just about how we talk about racism or Islamophobia or any other kind of bigotry. If these do escalate from aggressive arguments that spring up out of nowhere, there is just something to be said for promoting general consideration and kindness towards our fellow passengers. But of course, very reasonably, I think, and I think very stoically, passengers do want to see hate criminals educated and informed about their behaviour. It's not a fair question to ask a respondent, but we asked them essentially why hate crime exists on the transport network, and most argue that it's about a lack of cultural understanding. And that has a real bearing on how we talk about the issue. So while the transport network and communications in general are very good at telling us that hate crime is illegal, it's perhaps less effective at telling us why hate crime is wrong. And doing that would just give passengers a bit more reassurance that the transport network gets it, that they understand that you as a passenger have a right to be there, that you don't deserve to be victimized. And if we look at LGBTQ passengers, this is stated for emphasis rather than because it's anything particularly new. Of course, LGBTQ passengers have a strong fear of victimization and hate crime. The tragic thing here is that many passengers recognize that if they could pass as straight, or if they could pass as cisgender, their likelihood of being victimized would be lower. But of course, they tell us that they don't want to have to change who they are in order to feel safe. I mean, this quote on the right here, I think, is very instructive. She's always experienced hate for being gay. Her girlfriend is very wary. She doesn't want to hold hands in public or kiss them. But of course, people have a right to do these things and to be who they are. And again, much like with race-based or religious hate crime, they just want to see education, that this behavior is not okay, that their identities are valid, and that they have a right to travel without fear of harassment. Again, stated for emphasis, and I have to make it very clear, sexual harassment was very common among female passengers that we spoke to. Virtually every female respondent had experienced some form of sexual harassment on public transport, and they see themselves at greater risk of it because of public transport's enclosed spaces. The sheer volume of passengers who pass through mean that these behaviors, well, it means that you're more likely to encounter someone who is motivated to do these things. So many have been catcalled from a passing vehicle in the street, but the difference with public transport is that the behavior is sustained. You are stuck on the bus with that passenger. You're stuck on the train with that passenger. So the risk of a situation that is not just aggravating but traumatic and potentially dangerous feels substantial on public transport. And again, we asked people why this behavior exists. It's not a fair question, but the answer came back very strongly. This is about misogyny. It's not just about sexual gratification or kind of boogeymen who are, in some way unwell or unstable. There is a sense here, a belief quite rightly, I think, that these are sexual offenders who are attempting to put women in their place, if you like. And again, if you understand what people believe are the causes of the issue, you can understand how they would like the issue to be talked about and tackled. So we need to stress here that this is not just about how men treat women. It's not just about saying, don't do this, it's illegal. It's more than that. It's about how men think about women. So there needs to be, again, education about how men think about women, how they relate to them. Now, you know, we don't know whether this education piece needs to come from the transport network, from government, or police, or someone else. That it needs to come from somewhere. There needs to be some communications effort to stress that sexual behavior is both illegal and immoral, and that women have a right to travel safely, that this behavior has a real impact on how safe they feel. Even the sexual jokes, even the catcalling, leads to a fear of escalation that needs to be stopped. Now, witnesses and bystanders, we asked people how comfortable they would feel intervening in or reporting a crime or an unsafe behavior. And there are a number of barriers, but I need to stress here that none of this should be taken to mean that passengers don't want to help. I don't think I spoke to a single passenger who kind of doesn't care. So these barriers need to be read in terms of what can be done to help, rather than what can we do to adjust their thinking so that they care more. Everyone cares. It's just that there are a few barriers in place that would help them respond in the way that they would like to. So on the intervening side, fear of turning the perpetrator's attention on themselves is a big one. Understandably, people do not board the public transport network hoping to get into an argument or hoping to get into a fight. If people can keep their head down, then they will. But then uncertainty about what is actually happening. It needs to be stressed here that these behaviors are not caricatures. They are not happening in an advert. They are happening in the real world. And what that means is that the markers or the symptoms of that behavior are not always clear. Passengers do struggle to realize that what may present as an argument between acquaintances may in fact turn into a hate crime, or maybe they didn't catch the part that was racially motivated. It is hard to tell on a crowded train whether that person is close to that woman or too close to that woman. So the uncertainty point is difficult, but I think we need to stress that passengers have good instincts. I think deep down they understand what is happening. It's just a case of empowering them to trust their instincts, if you like. A lack of vigilance, keeping their head down, you know, it's not, I don't think we would be slicing passengers if we say that people don't board the network with the expectation that they have to be vigilant. Most people are perfectly happy with reading their book or going on their phone. It takes a lot to kind of shake a passenger awake to actually notice that something is going wrong. Whether we do that through education or by actively encouraging passengers to just look around them every now and again isn't necessarily clear, but just some disruptive communication that makes it clear that actually, look, it might just be worth looking around you to see what's happening because your instincts are good and there is stuff that you can do. Fourthly, knowing what to say. If I were doing this in person, I would straw poll the room, and I would probably get dozens of responses back in terms of what you're supposed to say to a criminal. But by and large, people don't know. Everyone has their approach that they believe might work. You know, maybe I insult them, maybe I humiliate them, maybe I try and reason with them. But knowing what to say, there doesn't seem to be a real playbook for how to intervene effectively. Now, lastly, and most perniciously, if you like, there is a belief that passengers will ask for help when they need help if they're a victim. Of course, what they're not understanding is that in the shock and the fear and the appall of the moment, it's difficult to know how to respond as a victim. So this is something that will need to be corrected quite quickly or quite succinctly that actually it's not for the victim to, wave their arms or shout for help. It is for you to show a bit of vigilance and show a bit of compassion that the victim may not be able or feel able to ask for help. Reporting, these challenges are a bit more logistical. Not knowing who to call. There are lots of organizations you could call, and I think in our survey we tested perhaps 10 or 11. A lot of people assume that the report must happen in the moment in order to be useful, that by the time you've got onto the platform or you've got above ground, it's too late. There is also a lack of faith that the report will be taken seriously. But we'll see some figures about this further on in the presentation, but there does need to be work to reassure passengers about the value of a police report and what happens to it. Most upsettingly, I think, one of the major barriers towards reporting is the sheer frequency of victimization. I mean, women told us that if they had to report the crime every single time they were groped or catcalled or harassed, it would become a second job. So how do we tackle that is unclear, but I think making it as streamlined as possible and as comfortable as possible to make a report would go some way to help there. Lastly, people do assume that they'll fail to record the necessary information. People are not experienced in making police reports. It's not something we do often. So just a bit of education around, what do I look for? Do I film the victim? Do I need to try and figure out their name, what they look like, what they're wearing? Just what line was I on? What time was it? What information do you actually need to retain in order to make an effective police report? Would be a really important clarification to make. The upside of this is that passengers do recognize that this behavior is wrong. 81% of passengers recognize that groping or unwanted physical behavior is a crime, and 13% recognize that it's harmful. Essentially, there are a group of passengers here who understand that the behavior is wrong, and therefore you've got quite a willing audience who are able to help or willing to help. They just need to have their behavior guided and encouraged in a slightly more concerted way. It does get a bit more ambiguous around catcalling or verbal harassment or things like that. Drinking on public transport as well was one that people didn't always recognize as a crime. But ultimately, for the really serious crimes that are out there, people recognize it as wrong, and we can work with that, and we can encourage it to build on behaviors that will actually make a difference among witnesses and bystanders. So when we measured what could make it difficult to report a crime on public transport, the big one was the possibility of people putting themselves at risk. 46% of people are worried about that. I guess with reporting a crime, it's the fear that you have to stay in the unsafe situation longer than you might like to. In order to report a crime, you have to stick around. You can't just move to the other carriage, perhaps in their view. 33% believe that the report might not be taken seriously. Around 20% have that worry about not being able to recall the necessary information. 20% worry about the hassle or the possibility of causing a delay. And only 10% would feel fully comfortable reporting an incident. No barriers, no difficulties. Only 10% are in that category, which I think could always be higher. And just, the killer statistic in a way is that 53% believe that it is neither easy nor straightforward to respond to a crime on to report a crime on public transport. And more than that, as I kind of alluded to earlier, potential bystanders lack a playbook for how to intervene. You know, the tactics are very much based on what you might call hearsay. You know, I'm sure my mother told me various things about what I'm supposed to do if I witness something like this. I'm sure many of your mothers have told you something about what to do about this. So kind of, there doesn't seem to be a unified tactic in terms of what to do when you witness an unsafe situation or something that makes you feel unsafe. People have told us that maybe you're supposed to humiliate the perpetrator, maybe you're supposed to pretend to know the victim and strike up a conversation with them. Maybe you're supposed to intimidate the perpetrator or film them or try and reason with them or educate them. There's a real lack of clarity here. How do I make a start in intervening in an unsafe situation? But that said, there is real willingness to learn. Like I said earlier, there's no one here who doesn't care, really. It's a very small minority of people who just don't particularly care about other passengers on the transport network. So they are open to being told what they're supposed to do. And when you think about it, you know, we regulate behavior on the transport network across all kinds of things. You know, we know that we're supposed to mind the gap. We know that we're supposed to keep our seat reservation ticket. We know we're supposed to move down the carriage rather than pooling by the door. We know that we're supposed to wear face coverings. We don't know how to respond to a crime in quite the same way. And there's an opportunity there. 64% of passengers would feel more confident responding to a crime if they had more information about how to help. So there's really fertile ground here. We can influence passenger behavior for the better and for the safety of people who need it most. We told passengers in our qualitative research that there are undercover police officers, in fact, a proactive unit policing sexual offences on the transport network. People recognise it as a good idea. They're happy it exists, but many people argue that it doesn't quite go far enough. Unfortunately, one can come away with the impression that you would have to get lucky in order to be rescued in this way, if you like. I mean, seeing that only 39 arrests were made in 2017 was kind of concerning. While many recognised that these 39 individuals may have gone on to victimise dozens of other people, it can feel like something of a drop in the ocean. But more than that, undercover policing can feel under-publicised. The common analogy here was with speed cameras, that speed cameras punch above their weight, if you like, because they are so well known about that even if there were relatively few of them, people would still be thinking about them because of the threat, if you like, of being clicked. Do we honestly believe at the moment that sexual offenders worry about an undercover police officer seeing their behaviour? I think we can safely assume that they don't. So a bit more publicising of what is being done, and a sense that actually, if you are a sexual offender, you are not guaranteed anonymity, you may well be caught, would be a very important thing to stress. And fundamentally, passengers are aware that undercover policing exists, but they see it as very much a terror-focused effort. You know, people assume that maybe the transport police will go after sexual offenders or hate criminals while they're at it, but there is not really a sense that the British Transport Police is dealing with sexual harassment or hate crime in a concerted way. And it bears stressing that some behaviours will be easier to influence than others when it comes to responding to unsafe situations. 53% of passengers would report the crime to a driver or a member of staff, compared to 42% who would report it to the police. But way down at the bottom is the 26% of people who would speak to the individual and try and stop the behaviour. It's going to be a real uphill battle to motivate people to intervene that proactively, I think, in an unsafe situation. And in fact, when we asked people, we polled people who said that they would do something, and we asked them how confident they would be to do each of these different things. So way up at the top, among people who feel that they would do something, reporting the crime to a member of rail staff feels achievable. Reporting the crime to a police officer feels fairly achievable. But way down at the bottom, again, only 34% of people who feel that they would do something would feel confident speaking to the individual. And not that many people either would feel confident supporting the victim while the behavior is taking place. So these are all behaviors that can be influenced. I think everyone wants to do the right thing. It's just how can we empower them to do so? Let's think briefly around support and communications. I mean, the first point here is that the overall efficiency of the network has a real influence on how safe passengers feel. If you can make your service more frequent, you reduce the risk of a passenger being left stranded. If you minimize delays, you lower the overall aggravation and stress of being on the transport network. And more amenities like Wi-Fi or lighting or help points or staff just help passengers feel a bit more looked after and a bit safer. The point here is that, in a sense, the transport network can keep doing what it's doing, but it needs to recognize that as they enhance their service, they are also helping passengers feel safer. So that in a way feels like a cause for optimism, that actually getting the basics right and delivering on an excellent service, that is helping vulnerable people feel safer. And it's just a case of continuing to do that as far as possible. Now, awareness of support organizations. I mean, obviously, awareness of the Metropolitan Police is very high. I assume the reason that this is not 100% is because, well, nothing is ever 100% in a quantitative survey, but it may also be that people only know of the Metropolitan Police as the police, and it could feel like a name that they're not familiar with. Anyway, awareness of the police, very high. Awareness of additional support organizations, very low, even among what you might call their constituent groups. It's a shame in a way that only 21% of those with religious attire have heard of Tell Mama, or that only 33% of the AME respondents have heard of Stop Hate UK. These numbers could always be higher. And we know that these organizations do matter to the people who feel unsafe, because having a support organization that truly understands what you're going through is really invaluable. So we could all do more to raise awareness of these organizations and make sure that they are helping as many people as possible. Technology. Now this is an ideal world kind of slide. It's a bit more interesting here to think about what these recommendations say about passengers rather than, you know, CCTV cameras that record sound and video, which obviously is not feasible. But there is a real sense at the moment that technology is under-leveraged. You know, I mentioned earlier that Uber and Lyft and Get, they're all using technology in a very deliberate and a very effective way to keep passengers safe. We are not seeing that from the transport network at the moment. So, you know, there could be a dedicated button on carriages to alert the driver or the police to a crime taking place. Absolutely, there should be enhanced Wi-Fi throughout the network. I mean, everyone wants Wi-Fi anyway. It's just the fact that it would allow for more instant reporting in the event of an unsafe situation. And absolutely having reporting functions built into a TfL app or a national rail app or even a BTP app, it would be extremely well liked if it were to be implemented. And it should be stressed that with CCTV, the passengers who feel unsafe are pretty comfortable with the idea of CCTV. In fact, many would want even more. They know that that CCTV is the primary evidence base on which prosecutions are made, and having it is a real reassurance that actually their criminal can be prosecuted and dealt with effectively. And just to bring the point home on the app, 75% of passengers would be likely to use an app to report a crime or an unsafe situation on public transport. Take this older female LGBTQ respondent, that what the British Transport Police need is a very nice app, anonymous, but what would hamper it is the lack of internet connection. So this internet point and this app point do need to kind of work along in parallel, perhaps. Anonymity, you know, the woman in that quote earlier mentioned anonymity as kind of a comfort or a source of comfort when we talk about reporting. It just strikes passengers as simpler and a bit less stressful than being known to the police. However, you know, we told them that actually if you're anonymous when you report a crime, it can limit the scope of a police investigation, and that can be met with disappointment. The idea of anonymously contributing to an existing or an ongoing police investigation isn't obvious, but when it's raised as a possibility, it feels helpful. In an ideal world, I think passengers would like to anonymously report a crime, and they hope that maybe CCTV would kind of do the work to find the perpetrator without the victim having to be involved extensively. But ultimately, what that means is that there are heightened expectations here. They're hoping for the comfort of anonymity combined with a very effective police response. But what that means is that the purpose of organizations like Crime Stoppers and True Vision can feel unclear. You know, well, if I'm staying anonymous and the police can't help as much, then what's the point? So there may be a bit of a role here for education or reassurance around the fact that many harassers are repeat offenders, that actually you could stay anonymous, and as more and more reports come in, you are building up a picture of the perpetrator. The process of reporting a crime, I mean, vulnerable people, women of color, people of color, transgender people, they do believe that their report will not be taken seriously, and that the process itself will be traumatic. I mean, if we take this quote from a younger transgender BAME person, they say that the process of doing the report could cause them to relive trauma. They feel they may have to out themselves in the process of making the report. So these are all things around which reassurance needs to be brought in quickly, or if reassurances can't be made, then fundamental changes to how the police respond to hate crime. But also, again, what information is required or useful. Again, passengers do not know how to make a report by default. It's not something we do often. It's not something we're trained to do. So just letting passengers know, here is what you're supposed to do if you see something unsafe, would be very helpful indeed. Just briefly about brand discipline. I mean, like I said, we tested maybe 10 or 11 different organizations over the course of this awareness question. People can be taken aback by the variety of organizations that can be used to report crime. And in that context, just telling the bus driver, just telling the ticket inspector, or another member of uniformed transport staff can feel like the path of least resistance. It's kind of, okay, there's someone in a high-vis jacket, I'm going to talk to them because they're right there, I know them, I trust them. So there is a simplification point here. And again, the BTP do risk being seen as purely terrorism focused without a great deal more emphasis on the fact that no crime is accepted on the transport network. The upshot, I think, is that passengers by and large feel comfortable talking to the British Transport Police. However, their faith in reporting a crime is a great deal lower. So a good deal of people would feel comfortable talking to them. A good deal of people understand who they are and what they do. But not that many people believe that the organization would deal with their report effectively. In fact, not that many people believe that it deals with the things that make them feel personally unsafe. So there's a relevance issue here as well as a trust issue. That said, I think expectations are reasonable. I mean, we asked people whose primary responsibility it ought to be to tackle different kinds of crime. And this is pretty accurate. People correctly believe, of course, that the terrorism issue should be dealt with by police, that hate crime is a police issue, that theft is a police issue, that groping or unwanted sexual behavior is a police issue. This is a positive slide. It shows that people broadly understand what the division of labor is between individual passengers, transport staff, and the police. Why should people make a report to the police is kind of the essence of this question. What do people see as the benefits of reporting a crime? Understandably, 84% of people see making sure the offender is caught as a major or pretty major benefit. Down at the bottom is this idea of contributing to crime statistics. People don't really understand what the role of crime statistics are when it comes to making police reports. We told our working group about the value of crime statistics in terms of operational decision-making within the British Transport Police and within the transport sector. But the value of that isn't immediately obvious to a run-of-the-mill passenger who didn't go through our research process, which was also an education process as much as it was a research one. But that said, if I just go back briefly, helping the police build up a profile of repeat offenders so that they can be caught, there's real sympathy for that idea. So actually, if we can remind people that, look, if you want to stay anonymous, you can still build up that profile of a repeat offender. And again, set expectations that, even if your report does not lead to an arrest, you are helping. Just reminding passengers of that, I think, would be a very important thing. So let's talk about the conclusions. I said at the beginning that we convened a working group of 15 passengers who felt that there was a problem, that they felt unsafe on public transport. They didn't always agree. It's difficult to get agreement between 15 people from very different walks of life, from very different circumstances. Antisocial behavior was one of the areas where there was a very healthy debate. On first impressions, it can feel like harmless fun. The working group kind of argued that they don't want to be draconian, but they accept that people with disabilities or people who are vulnerable may not know how to interact with a drunk passenger. I mean, the quote at the top says it better than I could, that, feet on seats are only not a big deal to the people who can see what they're about to sit down on. So it does matter. It should be prioritized. It should be tackled. And we don't want to let go of the kind of live and let live point, but there is broad recognition that many behaviors should be addressed, even if they're not strictly illegal. CCTV retention periods. We told our working group how short and how varied CCTV retention periods can be across different modes of transport. And it was frustrating. It was frustrating to hear. Passengers understand that victims of sexual harassment or hate crime can take time to process what's happened. And if the evidence is deleted before they have done that, it may as well not have been there in the first place. Lastly, enhancing phone signal and Wi-Fi. Now, again, everyone wants phone signal and Wi-Fi on the transport network, but it's just a case of understanding that it has a bearing on how safe people feel, that they can contact their friends to let them know they'll be on time. They can contact the police if they'll feel unsafe. They can contact a third-party charity. It's just a case of connecting passengers to the outside world and away from the sardine can or the enclosed space where they don't feel safe. So what are our key recommendations for London Transport? There is an important point here around educating the public on the practicalities, importance, and value of reporting a crime on public transport. It's simply not enough to say that behavior is illegal. It needs to be stressed, not just that it's wrong, but why it's wrong. if you can address bigotry in a holistic sense, you reassure victims that the authorities understand that the BCP is speaking the same language as you when it comes to hate crime, when it comes to sexual harassment. It would discourage perpetrators' behavior to the extent that they can be educated about their behavior. Explaining why it is wrong is a very good start. And it deals with the things that maybe fall short of criminal behavior. If we can address the question of how men think about women, how men treat women, then we're tackling issues that are antisocial and worrying, even if they fall short of criminal behavior. These are, passing jokes or unwanted comments that are not maybe as repeated or sustained enough to qualify as criminal, but nonetheless need to be dealt with and can be dealt with if we push the education point about how men think about women, or how people of color are thought about, or how LGBTQ people are thought about. There's also an education point about the British Transport Police and what they do. It would improve trust in their ability to police everything that's in their remit, not just terrorism, and empowering bystanders to act. There needs to be, or the public may benefit from, a clear set of actions that they can take to support victims in the moment, without putting themselves at undue risk. And again, we regulate passenger behavior across a range of things, but we do not support passengers when it comes to responding to crime. If there can be guidance or best practice that the industry can unite behind, that would be really valuable. Even if it's just to reassure passengers that, look, you can trust your instincts. You do know right from wrong. If you witness something that is clearly wrong, you can do something about it. You can call this number. So it's not just if you see something that doesn't look right vis-a-vis terrorism. It's if you see something that doesn't look right and it makes you feel that something is wrong. Technology. Again, it's under-leveraged in terms of making passengers feel safe. It's improved our lives across a range of different areas, particularly during the pandemic, but it does not seem to be helping passengers feel safe on public transport or giving them the tools that they need. Can we standardize and lengthen CCTV retention times? Can we get that app out into the world? Can we do more to help passengers report a crime on the carriage itself? If we can, it would be very helpful. Now, tone of voice for communications. We need to have a bit of a rethink, I think, around the tone of communications and messaging to ensure that they're supportive, effective, that they build trust, that they empower people to take action, and reinforce the moral point that there is not just illegal behavior and a number you can call, that there is a moral imperative for passengers to treat one another kindly, that needs to be protected, enhanced, and enabled wherever we can. Lastly, and I hope ending on a positive note, recognize that an efficient service is a safe service. Keep doing what you're doing. Keep focusing on a frequent service, a good, well-lit station, a well-maintained environment. Keep doing these things and passengers will feel safe, because safety is a feeling. And if you can help passengers feel that they are being looked after by an efficient, well-run service, you are doing a great deal to help passengers feel safe. So those are our recommendations. I'll just hand over to Safia, who will give us some concluding thoughts and round out our presentation.
Thank you, Angus, and thank you everyone watching. As we've heard, there is a lot to digest here, so we encourage you to email us at info@londontravelwatch.org.uk with any questions. You can find these slides on our website after the webinar, alongside our full recommendations for the transport industry and the police. Alongside this research, which Angus has just talked through, we held a focus group with the Young Women's Trust to better understand the views of young women travelling in London, the findings of which will also be available soon. So before we wrap up, I think it's worth reflecting on the coming months and what we can do in the immediate and long-term future. As we enter a period of travel post-restrictions, we know many people remain nervous of travel and hyper-conscious of their personal space. As our research has found, many incidents of hate crime or abuse are often triggered by confrontation between passengers, something that is unfortunately more likely at the moment. So we think it is more important than ever that we put the right tools in place to make sure transport users are supported throughout their journeys and any reporting processes. It's also important to make sure we continue to challenge the narrative which places the onus on those who are victims of crime, to empowering everyone to create a safer travelling environment. In particular, reflecting on these initial findings and recommendations to really think about how we can get more people to safely support others who experience unsafe behaviour or incidents. We think it should be quick, easy and convenient to report, making full use of existing technology, and those who witness incidents should feel informed and confident in how to act. Our research also shows how important it is to educate people that the BTP and Metropolitan Police are there for all incidents, not just terrorism, and encourage people to report cases of sexual harassment and racism. Because it is important, it will be heard and taken seriously. These actions are key if we are to help people feel safer while travelling around London, particularly at night. So thank you again, and we look forward to hearing from you soon with any questions or comments.